In 1849, a single egg in a California mining camp could cost $1, nearly a full day's wage back east. Flour sold for the price of gold dust, and a barrel of it once changed hands for $400. The men who poured into the Sierra Nevada chasing fortune found something they never expected: hunger, real, gnawing, scurvy-bringing hunger. The lucky ones learned to cook with almost nothing: salt pork, sour flour, beans, and whatever the land or a passing trader could spare. These 25 forgotten meals were not feasts, they were survival, hammered out over open fires by desperate men far from home. Some were strange, some were miraculous, and a few were barely food at all. Which one kept the most miners alive? Let's begin the countdown with number 25. Number 25. Acorn mush was the meal that saved 49ers when the wagons did not come. When flour ran out and the trading posts emptied, hungry miners turned to the knowledge of the Miwok and Maidu peoples who had lived in the Sierra foothills for thousands of years. Acorns were gathered by the basketful, cracked, pounded into meal on flat stones, then leached again and again with cold water to wash away the bitter tannins that would otherwise twist a man's stomach into knots. The pale paste was boiled with hot rocks, dropped into woven baskets until it thickened into a gray porridge. It tasted of earth and smoke, faintly sweet, deeply filling. Many a miner who sneered at it in good times came crawling back to it in a lean winter. It was the oldest food in California, keeping new men alive on the very ground they had come to tear apart. Number 24. Bear meat was the prize of any camp lucky enough to bring one down. A single grizzly or black bear could feed a dozen men for a week, and the fat was worth more than the flesh. Hunters rendered that thick yellow grease into a clear oil, storing it in tins to fry flapjacks and to grease boots through the wet months. The meat itself was dark and gamey, tough across the shoulders, rich and almost sweet along the back. Miners roasted it on green sticks over the coals, or stewed it for hours with onions and dried beans until it fell apart. A bear hunt was a gamble of powder and nerve, but the reward was real food in a land of hardtack and salt. For camps perched on the edge of starvation, a fat bear in autumn meant the difference between a hard winter and a deadly one. Number 23. Pinole carried Mexican and California miners through days when nothing else would keep. Ground from parched corn, sweetened with a little sugar and spiced with cinnamon, it was a dry meal that needed no fire and no pot. A man stuffed a pouch of it into his pack, and when hunger struck on the trail, he stirred a handful into a cup of cold creek water and drank it down. It swelled in the belly and held off weakness for hours. The 49ers who came up from Sonora swore by it, and many an American learned the trick after watching his neighbor stay strong on the climb. A few pounds cost almost nothing and lasted weeks without spoiling. It was the energy bar of the diggings, ancient and reliable, fuel for men who could not stop to cook. Number 22. Vinegar pie was the desperate dessert of men who had not seen fruit in months. With no apples, no berries, and no money for sugar to spare, camp cooks discovered that a splash of vinegar, a little flour, water, and whatever sweetener they could find, baked up into something startlingly close to a tart lemon custard. Poured into a crust made from saleratus dough and lard, then set over the coals in a Dutch oven, it emerged trembling and golden, sour and sweet at once. It fooled the tongue into believing in fruit. Bachelors far from any kitchen passed the recipe between tents like a secret. A slice of vinegar pie on a Sunday felt like a letter from home. It cost only pennies and used nothing a camp did not already have. For men starved of sweetness in every sense, that strange sour pie was a small, defiant comfort, proof that a little ingenuity could conjure a treat out of almost nothing. Number 21. Spotted pup was the rice pudding of the gold fields, named for the dark raisins scattered through its pale body like marks on a hound. Camp cooks boiled rice slowly with water and a handful of sugar, then folded in raisins or dried currants and let the whole thing thicken into a sweet, sticky mass. Some added a splash of canned milk when a peddler had it, others a shake of cinnamon if the spice box was not bare. It was filling, cheap, and easy to stretch across a crowd of hungry men. The raisins were the luxury, doled out by the careful cook who knew how rare dried fruit was on the diggings. Spotted pup showed up at the end of a long working day, ladled hot into tin cups, and a sweet supper after hours in the cold water of the creek lifted spirits like little else could. It was a dish that asked little and gave warmth, and men remembered it long after the gold was gone. Number 20. Tinned oysters were the unexpected delicacy of the boom towns, shipped around Cape Horn or up from the bay and sold at prices that would make a modern shopper faint. A single can could cost $1 or more, but a miner flush with dust did not blink. The salty, briny meat, packed in its own liquor, was a taste of the coast and of civilization, eaten straight from the tin with a knife or fried up with eggs and bacon when a man wanted to feel rich. In the rough saloons of Hangtown and San Francisco, oysters became the mark of a lucky strike, the food a man ordered when his pan had finally paid off. They needed no cooking and never spoiled in the can, which made them precious in a land with no ice. For the 49er who struck it big, a meal of tinned oysters told the world and himself that the gamble had been worth it. Number 19, molasses, was the sweetness that held a camp together. The dark syrup poured over flapjacks, stirred into coffee, and spooned straight from the jug when a man's spirit sagged. Sugar was dear and hard to come by, but molasses traveled well in barrels and kept for months in the heat. A peddler with a full cask could name his price, and miners paid it gladly. They sopped it up with biscuits and boiled it down with water into a rough candy for a holiday treat. The thick, smoky sweetness clung to everything and stained every beard in camp. For men working brutal hours in cold streams, that jolt of sugar was more than pleasure. It was fuel and morale in one sticky pour. A camp without it felt poorer than one short on gold. Number 18, split pea soup simmered in camp pots through the long, wet Sierra winters, a thick green broth that asked nothing of a man but patience. Dried peas cost little and kept forever, which made them the careful miner's insurance against the days when the trail froze and no supplies came through. A cook set the peas to bubbling at dawn with a scrap of salt pork or a ham bone if he was lucky, and by supper the pot had turned to a dense, savory pottage you could stand a spoon in. It filled bellies, warmed cold hands, and stretched a single bone across many meals as the pot was topped up day after day. For men who had gambled everything on a hole in the ground, a steaming bowl of pea soup was a quiet kind of security, the taste of having outlasted another hungry week. Number 17, boiled rice was the workhorse grain of the diggings, brought in great quantities by Chinese miners who arrived by the thousands and changed the way the whole gold country ate. It cooked fast, stretched far, and filled a man up after a day bent over a rocker box. The Chinese camps made it the center of every meal, dressing it with dried fish, salted vegetables, and sauces carried across the Pacific that smelled of a world the Americans did not understand. Curious neighbors traded for a bowl and found it good. Plain rice cost only a few cents a pound and never went to waste. The scrapings boiled again into a thin gruel for breakfast. In a land where flour spoiled and meat rotted, rice was steady and dependable, and long after the rush ended, the rice the Chinese brought stayed in the California kitchen for good. Number 16, sauerkraut and pickles were the medicine no miner knew he needed until his teeth began to loosen and his gums turned black. Scurvy stalked the camps, killing men who had plenty of bacon and flour, but not a scrap of anything fresh. The wise ones, often German and Eastern European immigrants, packed barrels of sauerkraut and crocks of pickled cucumbers, and the sharp, sour crunch of fermented vegetables drove the sickness back. A jar of pickles could cost a small fortune when scurvy was raging, and men paid it to save their lives. The 49ers learned the hard way that gold meant nothing to a man too weak to swing a pick. That sour barrel in the corner of the tent, unglamorous and pungent, was one of the quiet heroes of the gold fields, keeping men upright when the meat and bread alone would have let them die. Number 15, wild venison brought fresh meat to camps that lived on salt and tin, the reward of a steady hand and a long climb into the high country. Deer ranged thick through the Sierra in the early years, and a single buck could feed a tent of men for days, the surplus cut into strips and dried for the journey ahead. Hunters roasted the loins over open coals, fried the liver the same night it was killed, and stewed the tougher cuts with beans and onions until the meat surrendered. The taste was clean and lean, a welcome change from the greasy monotony of sowbelly. A good shot earned a man respect and a full plate, and venison stew bubbling over the fire drew every nose in camp. But game thinned fast as thousands of hungry men hunted the same hills, and within a few years, the easy deer were gone. For a brief season, though, fresh venison was the closest thing the diggings had to a feast. Number 14, cornmeal mush and Johnny cakes carried the flavor of home for the many 49ers who came from southern and frontier farms. A pot of yellow cornmeal stirred into boiling salted water, thickened into a mush that filled a man at breakfast, and sliced and fried the next morning, fed him again. When a cook had a little grease and a hot griddle, that same meal became Johnny cakes, flat golden rounds crisped at the edges and eaten dripping with molasses. Cornmeal was cheaper and more forgiving than wheat flour, and it stood up to the damp better in a poorly sealed sack. The simple, faintly sweet taste of corn reminded men of kitchens and mothers a continent away. It was humble food, the kind nobody bragged about, but it showed up morning after morning and never let a man down. In a place built on luck and disappointment, that quiet dependability was its own kind of gold. Number 13, son of a gun stew, was the dish that proved nothing from a butchered animal would go to waste. When a steer or calf was killed, the cook gathered everything the choicer cuts left behind: the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the sweetbreads, and the marrow gut, and threw the lot into a single great pot. Hours of slow simmering with onions, chiles, and whatever seasoning the camp could muster melted the rough parts into a rich, dark stew that men ate with surprising relish once hunger had stripped away their squeamishness. The name was a polite version of what tired, profane miners actually called it. It was thrifty cooking born of necessity, a way to honor the whole animal in a land where meat was too precious to throw away. A man who turned up his nose at the organ meats in the city learned fast in the diggings that a full pot of son-of-a-gun stew was a blessing, not a hardship. Number 12, slumgullion was the catch-all stew that defined camp cooking, a name that came to mean any thin, watery mess of whatever a man could lay his hands on. A scrap of salt pork, a handful of beans, a few wrinkled potatoes, a wilted onion. All of it went into the pot with enough water to stretch it across however many hungry men sat waiting. The result was rarely the same twice, and rarely much to look at, but it was hot, it was filling, and it kept bodies moving through the cold. The word itself became camp slang for anything cheap and barely adequate, and miners groaned and ate it anyway. Slumgullion was the food of lean stretches, the meal a cook threw together when the larder was nearly bare and payday was still days off. For all its sorry reputation, that murky pot of odds and ends carried untold thousands of men through the days when there was simply nothing better to be had. Number 11, Dried beef and jerky were the trail food that never failed. Lean strips of meat salted and smoke-dried until they would keep for months in any weather. A miner heading up to a new claim or out prospecting alone in the high country filled his pouch with jerky because it weighed almost nothing and would not rot in his pack. Gnawed cold on the move, it gave a man the strength to keep climbing. Tossed into a pot of boiling water with a few beans, it softened back into the heart of a quick stew. Making it was the work of a good day's butchering, the meat cut thin, rubbed with salt, and hung over a low smoky fire until the moisture was gone. Native peoples and Mexican vaqueros had perfected the craft long before the Americans arrived, and the 49ers copied it gladly. In a land without refrigeration, dried beef was meat a man could trust, and trust was a rare thing in the goldfields. Number 10, dried apple pie was the sweet ghost of orchards left behind in the East, conjured back to life over a campfire by homesick men. Fresh fruit was a near impossibility in the early diggings, but dried apples shipped well in sacks and softened back to life with a long soak in water. Sweetened with sugar or molasses and folded into a crust of flour and lard, then baked in a covered Dutch oven nestled in the coals, the pie filled a tent with a smell that could bring a hardened man close to tears. Apples were so prized that a single pie might be the highlight of a whole month, shared out in careful slivers among partners. Peddlers sold dried apples at a steep markup, knowing exactly what they were worth to lonely men. That warm, cinnamon-scented wedge was more than dessert. It was memory made edible, a taste of front porches and family suppers, a long, hard road away from the cold creeks of California. Number 9, Dutch oven biscuits raised with saleratus were the daily bread of camps that had no time and no yeast for proper loaves. Saleratus, an early baking soda, let a cook turn flour, water, salt, and a little grease into hot biscuits in minutes. No waiting for dough to rise. He mixed the dough fast, dropped it into a greased iron Dutch oven, buried the lid in coals, and shoveled more coals on top so the heat came from every side. In a quarter hour, the lid lifted on a batch of golden biscuits, crisp outside and soft within. Eaten with bacon grease, molasses, or a spoon of beans, they were the backbone of breakfast and the filler of every plate. Too much saleratus left a bitter, soapy taste, so a good camp cook earned real respect for getting it right. Those quick iron-baked biscuits, hot and humble, were the closest thing many a miner had to fresh bread for years on end. Number 8, coffee, boiled black and strong enough to stand a spoon in, was the one luxury almost no camp would do without. The beans were bought green, roasted in a skillet over the fire, then crushed with a hatchet or a rock, and dumped straight into a pot of boiling water, grounds and all. A man let it settle, poured it scalding into a battered tin cup, and drank it bitter, sweetened with molasses if he had any. That first cup before dawn, breath fogging in the cold mountain air, was what got a miner down to the freezing creek for another brutal day. Coffee was traded, hoarded, and fought over, and a camp that ran out of it was a miserable place indeed. It carried no nutrition to speak of, but the warmth and the jolt it gave were medicine for the spirit. For men far from comfort, that smoky black brew was a small ritual of normalcy, repeated faithfully every single morning. Number 7, the Hangtown Fry was the meal a miner ordered the day he struck it rich, the most famous extravagance to come out of the entire gold rush. Born in the rough town of Placerville, once known as Hangtown, the story goes that a newly wealthy prospector strode into a hotel and demanded the most expensive dish they could make. The cook combined the 3 priciest ingredients on hand, eggs, bacon, and oysters shipped in from the coast, and fried the lot together into a rich, salty scramble. At a time when eggs cost $1 each and oysters had traveled hundreds of miles, the dish was a deliberate display of sudden fortune. It became a legend, the meal that told the world a man's gamble had paid off. The Hangtown Fry was never about hunger. It was about triumph, the taste of a dream come true in a country where most dreams came to nothing. It survives on California menus to this day. Number 6. Hardtack was the iron ration that crossed oceans and mountains to reach the diggings. A flat, rock-hard biscuit made of nothing but flour and water, baked until it was nearly indestructible. Sailors and soldiers had lived on it for centuries, and the 49ers inherited it as the food that simply would not spoil. A man could carry it for months, and it would still be there, hard as a roofing shingle when he needed it. Eating it was the trick. Bitten dry, it could crack a tooth, so miners soaked it in coffee, softened it in stew, or crumbled it into hot grease to fry. Weevils were a constant companion, and old hands learned to eat in the dark rather than see what shared their biscuit. Hardtack was never good, but it was reliable, and on the long trail or in the lean weeks, it stood between a man and starvation. It was survival in its plainest, most unforgiving form. Number 5. Fresh beef was the rare red-letter day in a camp's calendar. The feast that came only when a drover managed to herd cattle up the rough mountain trails to sell at staggering prices. When a steer was finally killed near a settlement, word spread fast, and men came down from their claims to buy their share. The steaks were thrown straight onto the coals, charred outside and bloody within, eaten with a kind of reverence by men who had tasted nothing but salt pork for months. The smell of fresh meat sizzling over an open fire drew a crowd like a church bell. It cost dearly, but a 49er who had been living on beans and bacon would empty his poke for a proper beefsteak. Nothing was wasted, the bones going to soup and the fat to the grease tin. Fresh beef was a celebration, a reminder of the abundance left behind, and the reward a lucky strike might one day buy back. Number 4. Flapjacks were the sound and smell of morning in every mining camp from the Motherlode to the Klondike. A cook stirred up a quick batter of flour, water, and saleratus, sometimes thinned with a little of the sourdough starter every old hand kept alive, then ladled it onto a hot greased griddle until the edges bubbled and browned. Flipped with a practiced jerk of the wrist, they came off in golden stacks, eaten dripping with molasses or bacon fat. They were cheap, fast, and filling, the perfect fuel for men facing a long day in cold water. A skilled flapjack flipper was a prized member of any partnership, and bets were laid on who could turn a cake highest without dropping it in the fire. Simple as they were, flapjacks were a daily pleasure in a grinding life, hot and sweet and ready in minutes. For countless miners, the memory of the gold rush smelled like batter hitting a hot pan at dawn. Number 3. Salt pork, the fatty cured belly the miners called so-belly, was the meat that built the gold country, the cheap salty staple that turned up at nearly every meal. Packed in barrels of brine, it kept for months without spoiling, which made it the only practical meat for a land with no ice and no fresh supply. A cook sliced off thick slabs and fried them until the fat ran clear, using the grease to cook everything else in the camp. Beans, biscuits, flapjacks, and potatoes all swam in rendered sow-belly. The meat itself was tough and brutally salty, often soaked first to make it bearable, but it gave a man the fat and energy he needed to swing a pick all day. Miners ate so much of it that many fell ill from the relentless grease and salt. Yet without it, the camps could not have survived. So-belly was not loved, but it was everywhere, the greasy foundation under nearly every plate in the diggings. Number 2. Beans were the unkillable staple of the gold rush, the food more men ate more often than anything else in the camps. Dried beans cost little, kept forever, and filled a hungry belly like nothing else, which made them the heart of the miner's diet. A cook set them simmering at first light with a chunk of salt pork, a little molasses, and water, and let them bubble all day at the edge of the fire until they turned soft and savory. By supper, the whole camp smelled of beans, and the same pot stretched across breakfast, dinner, and the next day's trail lunch. Men grew so sick of them that beans became the butt of every camp joke, yet they ate them anyway, because beans were always there. Cheap, hearty, and endlessly reliable, they did more to keep the 49ers alive than any other single food. The gold rush ran quite literally on beans, the humble fuel of 100,000 impossible dreams. And finally, in first place, sourdough bread crowned the gold rush table as the food so essential that the miners themselves took its name. The old prospectors became known as sourdoughs after the precious crock of fermented starter, each man guarded like treasure, sometimes sleeping with it to keep it warm through freezing nights. With no commercial yeast to be had, that bubbling, sour-smelling mixture of flour and water was a camp's only way to raise real bread, and a healthy starter could be kept alive for years, passed between partners and handed down like an heirloom. A spoonful stirred into fresh dough, leavened biscuits, flapjacks, and round loaves baked golden in a Dutch oven, their tangy, chewy crumb a daily miracle in the wilderness. The sharp, faintly sour smell of a working crock meant a camp would eat well. Letting a starter freeze or die was a small tragedy. More than beans, more than bacon, sourdough was the soul of the Gold Rush kitchen, the living thing that turned plain flour into the bread that kept a generation of dreamers alive. San Francisco bakes it still. From acorn mush ground on ancient stones to the sourdough crock that named a generation, these 25 forgotten meals are the real story of the Gold Rush, not the nuggets and the fortunes, but the daily fight to stay alive. They were the food of desperate men far from home, stretching a little into enough and turning hardship into supper one fire at a time. Most found no gold, but they found ways to survive, and these dishes carried them through. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments which one surprised you most, and subscribe for more forgotten history from the table.